Welcome to the ATP Project. You're with your host, Just Steve, and I'm a naturopath and a scientist. And today is a really special edition one because there is so much information out there in the world. Look, I haven't got my phone on me with me because I don't bring them to podcasts, but my phone, connected to the internet, has access to pretty much every single medical journal there is on the internet, and obviously all the other information on the internet. And it's got access to YouTube, and it's got access to Facebook and Instagram and TikTok and all these sorts of other social media events. Now, why am I mentioning those social media things? Is because a lot of people get their news through social media. I've got a friend who was interested in buying a house, and what happened was his brother sent him a video saying, oh, before you buy a house, look at this evidence. And it wasn't evidence per se, it was a guy on YouTube speaking. And a lot of people get information like that. And I remember when I was a lecturer at a college that I ran, and the students would say, oh, what do you think of this person? They'd send me a link to YouTube video of some guy talking about something health related. And I'd go, oh, that's very interesting, but where is his or her information on that? Because it's great for me to sit here, and here I'm sitting on YouTube right now giving you information. Yes, I've got references, so if you ask me for references, I've got them, but most people don't bother with that. They just give a podcast out there, and there's nothing wrong with that. But what we have to consider is the level of evidence. Now, there is a hierarchical level of evidence. I'm going to show you here, but we'll put it on the screen probably for niftiness. There's a little triangle there, as you can see. Now, the triangle has got things at the bottom and things at the top. Now, the things at the top is called MA, which is a meta-analysis. Now, meta-analysis is considered the highest form of evidence. And on this chart, the lowest form of evidence is in vitro studies. Does everyone know what in vitro means? It means in a test tube or on a petri dish. It's that sort of study, and animal research. They're at the bottom of the evidence hierarchical table. Now, does this mean they're bad? No. They can be very, very valuable, and I've got an example of one here. And of course, that can be a great starting point too, because you may have a great idea for, let's say, a mouthwash, and you have to start somewhere to determine whether your mouthwash works. Now, let's say you're developing a mouthwash and you want it to be natural, and you want to put a couple of herbs in there. Okay. Well, you could start with an in vitro study. In other words, you could get the herbs in the concentration you want to put them in the mouthwash. You could grab a couple of bacteria that are normally found in the mouth. You could harvest them on a petri dish, and they, of course, grow because a petri dish grows bacteria. It's full of agar and all these things that feed the bacteria. And then you put a drop of each of these herbs in the concentration you need on the petri dish, and you watch to see what happens over a few days. And what you find on a petri dish is that around the herbal extracts, some of them, you'll find that the bacteria dies. So that means, that would indicate that that particular herb is toxic for that particular bacteria. Now, for example, there are two types of bacteria in the mouth that are quite dangerous. Streptococcus mutans and, of course, Lactobacillus acidophilus in the mouth can both lead to dental caries. So what I would do is, if I was developing an in vitro test tube study, is I would grow those two bugs on a couple of plates like that, put a drop of each herb in each, and watch them there, put them at 37 degrees, which is the temperature of my mouth, and stick them in a humidifier for a few days and see what happens. And what you'll find is, of course, that some of the herbs will kill the bacteria and some won't. And that's a great way to start off testing. And in fact, that study has already been done. This paper here is that exact in vitro test. Now, the herbs they tested in this particular case, just so you know, and what I'm doing here is, if you look at the title of the paper there and you look at the thing, it's got a little section up top there and then a whole lot of writing at the back. I'm going to keep it simple. This very little part here is the abstract. Now, the abstract is a very brief summary of what's in the paper. And I'm going to say read that first, but don't only read the abstract. You have to read the whole paper. Now, let's have a look at the abstract. And I'm going to start with, weirdly, I'm going to start with the conclusion. And as the sound guy and recording artist said, that's a spoiler. And he came up with that term, so I'm going to use it. That's a spoiler for the paper. And I'm going to read the spoiler first. So this is what this study that's been published has found. And the study says methanolic, in other words, just alcoholic extract of cinnamon and clove which has considerable antimicrobial activity against Streptococcus and Lactobacillus acidophilus, and a new tool for minimally invasive and adhesive dentistry avenues. Now, that's what the study concluded. Now, they tested 5 herbs. They tested cinnamon and cloves, and they also tested turmeric, ginger, and blackseed. And those 5 plants is what they tested. So obviously on the Petri dish, they put the drop of turmeric, extract on there. It didn't kill anything. It's like, oh, well, good. And that's exactly what you'd expect to find in this, because turmeric can be taken orally and it doesn't kill your microbiome. And cinnamon and cloves are used in foods. And of course, everybody knows they're not dangerous for you. So the safety of those herbs taken ingestingly has already been proven. So what this has found is that just from an in vitro test, you can see that mouth rinse with a cinnamon and clove herbal extract kills the bad bacteria in your mouth that cause dental caries and cause all the plaque build-up. So that's very interesting. So if you wanted to develop a mouthwash, this would be a great place to start. Now, as I said, the safety of those herbs have been established. Now, in a lot of in vitro tests, test tube tests, the safety hasn't been established, okay? So let's say I'm developing a drug that's going to kill, let's say the bacteria. And this drug is a completely new to nature molecule. No one has ever taken it before, because you've got to remember, most drugs on the market are new molecules to the world. They've never been, you can patent them. So you don't know how they're going to go in the body. But the first thing we want to look at is we get a bunch of bacteria, and let's say we want to test this to kill Streptococcus bacterial infection. We put a drop on it and it kills it. That's great. That's terrific. But then we've got to see how it actually, what happens if someone ingests it. Now, I don't just go down the road and give it to a few kids and say, try this, see what happens. You don't. The first thing you go to is then your animal studies. And so you go to the animal studies and you give it to 100 rats, and at the same time you infect them with Streptococcus infection. So they're all infected. You give it to them at the dose you think would be reasonable, and maybe different doses, and you might find the really high doses kill them, and the really low doses, they got better, for example. And then you've established safety in animals. And you go, okay, well, let's see what, we've established that it's safe in animals. And so then you give the dose to a small group of people. And that drug can be just in a small group of people, which can be a pilot study. And they call it a pilot study because you might only give it to 10 to 12 people with the infection that is already in hospital. And let's say this infection is quite a bad one, and the chances are you could get really, really sick with this infection. You go, all right, we're going to do a trial in hospital, and we're going to give it to half a dozen people infected with this thing. And the reason why we're giving it to them in hospital is they can be monitored. We can look after their liver. We can look after their kidneys. We can look after it. We can do blood tests every hour if we want. We can test them to make sure this drug is at least safe, and we can see what happens. So, we might, go to a hospital where you approach the ethics board of the hospital and say, listen, I've got this drug. It's safe in rats. It's this molecule here. There's no evidence that it harms rats in this particular dose. So we're going to give this dose. We'll give you more, of course, for a larger human. We're going to give it to 12 humans, but we're going to give it to them in hospital, and we're just going to see what happens. All right? And you get ethics approval for that with all your safety data there. You give it to these 12 people. Let's say they get better. It's like, oh, good. Well, that's great, but would have they got better anyway? Well, we don't know. But what we now know is that it's safe for humans, or relatively safe. So we go to a university then and we say, hey, university, we've got this drug that has been shown safety in a small group of people, pilot study, in animal studies and in vitro tests to show that it does kill this bacteria. These 12 people got better. They didn't get sick. They had all this stuff measured. So we want to up this and give it to 100 people. And the ethics approval takes ages, but let's say they go, yep, no worries. They go through it. There's a long process, but you go through and you give it to 100 people in a clinical trial. And a clinical trial can be, rightio, we're going to get 100 people with this infection, and we're going to give half of them the drug, and half of them we're going to give a placebo, which is a dummy pill. I think you know what a placebo is. And what we're going to do is the doctor that's going to be prescribing this drug is going to be prescribing the placebo and the active pill, the drug that we're trying to develop, and we will not tell him or her what they are giving the people. In other words, the doctor doesn't know what they're giving, whether it's a placebo or the actual active drug. And that's called a double-blind, placebo-controlled, interventional trial. In other words, it's double-blinded. The doctor doesn't know if they're getting it. The patient doesn't know if they're getting the drug. So the doctor can't give a nudge and a wink and go, oh, this is the real stuff. Go. They do not know, so they can't be biased. The patient doesn't know. The only person that knows is they get A or B, and one of them's active and nobody knows. It's in a capsule. They look identical. Placebo is the same. And it's controlled. In other words, we look, we measure, we still measure health and safety, liver tests. We do all the potential tests that could be a problem. And that's that's a placebo-controlled trial. And what we're going to also do is we're going to randomise this. Now, what does randomisation mean? People think, oh, well, it's random. We just give it to half and the other half don't. No. We make sure there's an even number of males and females, an even number of severity of diseases, an even number of ages. So we're getting old and young people in the placebo group and the active group. That's randomisation. It's the opposite to random. It's just randomisation is making sure you get even numbers, not only even numbers, but even ages, even sexes, everything the same, weight, everything. We're trying to make sure that the people are pretty evenly mixed up. And we do that. And that's called a double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomised trial. If you can see what all those words mean. That's what they mean. And that's up there. That's third from the top when it comes to evidence. So it's pretty high up, a randomised controlled trial. And so that's really good. Let's say our drug did well. It didn't hurt anyone, and the 50 that took it got better. The 50 that didn't, some died, some didn't, some whatever. They just, naturally got better over a longer period of time. And it's like, okay, so the randomised controlled trial was a success. Then what we do is we repeat it over and over and over again with larger groups. We get the evidence up there, and we then make a number of randomised controlled trials. And then when there's a number of these randomised controlled trials done, we can do what's called a meta-analysis on these. Now, a meta-analysis is the analysis you do after all the randomised controlled trials are done, and they group all the data together, and it says, bang, this is what we found. And if the meta-analysis says, look, this stuff, relatively few side effects, or it's got this side effect, and we know about it, but, it helps people, clears up their streptococcus infection. That is the strongest piece of evidence on our little triangle. Meta-analysis is at the top. And that's what they call a Class 1A evidence. And that means that you've got a pretty good idea that particularly goes on, and that's the one that really helps people. Now, I've got one paper here, and that's the in vitro trial. And what I've done now is I've themed another trial. I'm going to go through these one at a time and have a look at a randomised control trial, a review paper, which is something different, and then a systemic meta-analysis or a meta-analysis. So there's 3 papers here. I just printed them off this morning. They're open access. In other words, you can download them on the internet free. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at each paper and go through them individually and then sort of summarise. Now, these are all 2021 papers. They're all published within the last month. So they're quite recent papers, and they're all on turmeric, because I just thought I'd pick a herb and have a theme. Now, I could have picked anything, but I just picked turmeric. The first paper I want to look at here is it's called the Turmeric Extract Improves Serum Inflammatory Markers and Mental Health in Participants Who Are Overweight. And it's in the title, a randomised double-blind placebo-controlled trial. And they use a Latin term, curcuma longa, which is Latin. Now, the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to cheat. I'm going to go to the spoiler. I'm going to go to the back page and see who done it, right? So I'm going to read the conclusion for you. It says, turmeric may ameliorate chronic low-grade inflammation and thus help to improve mental health and mood disturbance. And this was in the population tested, which is an obese population. Why did they test an obese population? It's because when you've got a lot of fat on your body, you've got a lot of inflammatory chemicals coming out of these fat cells, and it's going all the way. So it's a great population to test. They're otherwise healthy, and what they did was they just gave them this. Now, I'm going to read you through the methodology here. And the methodology was, with the abstract, it's usually got 4 sections. It's got the background information, the methods, the results in detail, and then the take-home message, the conclusion. So the background talks about, I won't read all the words here, but it says, turmeric is a well-known anti-inflammatory agent, activities in animal and human studies, but basically we're going to explore what goes on. Now, the methods is interesting. I'm going to read this word for word just so it makes a bit of sense. We performed a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled study in healthy subjects aged 50 to 69 that are overweight. Okay, so think of that population. It's my age, overweight. And they looked at those people. They got 2 capsules containing turmeric for 12 weeks, okay? And they measured the serum inflammatory markers, and that would have been C-reactive protein. Now, if you want to know what they are, you can go to the detailed pages, and we'll get to those in a sec. Participated also completed 2 questionnaires, which is what they call a MOS, which is a medical outcome study, and a short-form health survey, and a profile of mood scale, which is called a POMS scale. Now, why am I mentioning those? They are all recognised methods of evaluating people. You can measure inflammation by the blood, and you can measure how someone feels using a POMS. So they're very, very well research methodology, so they're used all throughout the medical field. Now, I'm going to read the results long-term here. It says, after the intervention, which was the turmeric treatment, the turmeric group had a significantly lower body weight and body mass index than the placebo group. Now, let's just stop there because there's more to it. But can you see what happened there? The turmeric itself, forget anything else. Remember, it was placebo, randomized control. They didn't know they were taking it. Helped them lose weight straight off the bat. And I'll explain why. Basically, if you reduce inflammation, you reduce insulin resistance, you can help lose weight. So can turmeric help you lose weight? Yes, you can. What's the evidence? Double-blind placebo-controlled trial. Okay, good, strong evidence there. Okay, they also had a significantly lower serum C-reactive protein. Now, what is that? That's the chemical that's well known to measure inflammation. So the people that got the turmeric, they didn't know they were taking it, but their blood levels of CRP dropped. Now, that's very powerful information because, if I said, oh, how are you feeling? Oh, I was sort of feeling a bit better, But if I measure your blood CRP, you can't magically force that down. So that's a very strong piece of evidence. And complement component was lower, which is the inflammatory marker. In addition, the turmeric group showed significant improvement in the MOS SF36 mental health score and the POMS anger hostility score. In other words, their mental health improved based on their own ratings. Remember, and I'll say it again, double-blind, randomized placebo trial. They didn't know they were taking it. They both got these yellowy capsules. One, it'll tell you in the methodology what the placebo had in it. Something yellow, okay? So very, very interesting results, isn't it? Now, that's a randomized control trial. That's a very high piece of evidence. It's 3rd on the scale. That is really good. So you can say from this that turmeric may ameliorate chronic low-grade and mental health. Now, it says may, and you might be going, well, that's a bit weak. Why doesn't it say it does? It kicks ass. Science is never settled. There's a lot of these sayings in study that says that in science that you can't say the science is settled. You're always going to investigate further. And in the studies, you'll see at the end, they say in all the papers, further research is needed. I've never seen a paper said, that's it, you don't need any more research, we've proven this fact. It doesn't work like that. Further research is always needed. Now, the good thing about turmeric in this case is its safety has been established already because people have been consuming turmeric forever and a day. But also you'll see after all those things that I said that are reduced body weight and reduced body mass index, there's this thing in brackets that says P less than 0.05. And that's what we call the p-values. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, what does that mean? Well, what that means is that there's a less than 1 in 20 chance that this was a fluke. less than 1 in 20. In other words, it's pretty much this is what you call clinically significant. And in statistics, that's the cutoff period for the result to be significant. So you can certainly say that that's what the results were found. So, if it CRP dropped from 5 to 4.9, that wouldn't be significant and the p-value would be much higher. What we want, the lower the p-value, the better. Less than 0.05 is significant, and that's totally and utterly fine. So what we can say from this study is that in the population group, the 50 to 69-year-olds that are overweight, turmeric at the doses in here, and we'll get to that in a sec, does reduce inflammation, and you probably already know that, but now you know it further, and helps with mental health. So if you see turmeric in a product, you know that it does that. Now, what dose did they use? And all the methodology is in the following pages. I've just read the abstract to you. And you might be going, well, that's great. I want to go to the shop and get some turmeric because I'm overweight and I want to help my mental health. And you go, okay, well, how much do you take? And they go, well, I don't know. Well, let's find out. And so you can go into the paper here and you can look at the intervention part. Now, you'll see in the particular paper, you'll see that there's what they call the intervention part. And they can tell you how much of the turmeric that they took. So you can look that up. You can also look up the inflammatory markers, how they measured that, the forms, and everything to do with the turmeric. And the intervention and also how they tested it. So there are loads and loads of information. So it talks about the 339 potential participants in the methodology. And so from that, you can work out exactly how much of you can take of turmeric to improve your mental health if you're overweight and if you're over 50 to 69. Now, that's what the study says. It was done in men and women. So you can sort of look at that study and make a fair assumption that if you're 45, it'll probably help you too. And if you're 75, it'll probably help you too. But that's how you read a randomized placebo-controlled trial. It went for 12 weeks. So, you can safely say that after 12 weeks, you will probably, 95% chance you'll feel better. So that's how you read these particular randomized controlled trials. Now, we'll get back to that a little bit later on, but I want to look at another piece of evidence here, which is one up on the food chain called a systemic review. Now, already I've picked up this systemic review on turmeric, and it's fatter. It's got a lot of information. Systemic reviews are basically where a group of experts in the area get together, they look at all the literature on the area that they want to look at. It's quite broad. It's not just obese, inflammatory, mental health. It's like, in this case, it's the role of turmeric in the management of chronic disorders, which is a big group, chronic disorders. And it basically, there's about, probably 15 experts in this particular area. They're reviewing the paper and they're reviewing all the literature that's done on it. So this is a great place if I'm doing research on it. Say I'm giving a talk on turmeric, this would be a great place to start. If someone just said, give a talk on turmeric and what it does, this would be a great place to start, is to look at the review papers. There's, I'm just going to skip right to the back here. There's 232 references that they've used, medical references, peer-reviewed references, and I'll get to peer-reviewed later on, what that means, basically to get this paper together. So it's a really great summary. It's published in 2021. It was published on the 24th November 2021. Now, the abstract is very interesting because unlike the randomized controlled trial, this is a literature review. In other words, they don't intervene, they don't give someone turmeric and watch them. They look at all the literature, like this study, maybe in here, on all this sort of stuff to see what's out there. It's like a big review. It says, okay, there's been a whole heap of studies done on turmeric. Let's look at how turmeric affects the management of chronic disorders. And a chronic disorder is something that lasts a long time. So your heart diseases and some chronic neurological disorders are in here. So basically, it's very, very important. And it looks at the different forms. Basically, it says that it's very, very safe and it helps with loads and loads of diseases. Basically, I'll read what it says. It says curcumin is a primary polyphenol in turmeric's curcuminoid class. It has a wide range of therapeutic applications such as anti-inflammatory, we kind of know that, antioxidant, anti-diabetic, hepatoprotective. Hepatoprotective means it protects your liver. It's antibacterial, anti-something else we can't say. So it pretty much like helps, reduce inflammation, antibacterial, and helps your liver, everything. So, okay, that's like its introduction and background. So let's have a look of what the paper talks about. Now, I'm going through, all the background here on it and all this sort of stuff. But then we come to a bit where it says the therapeutic applications. So it's a very powerful antioxidant. So the review paper says, look, it's an antioxidant. In other words, it mops up free radicals, and it goes into which free radicals it mops up. So it's a great antioxidant. Next one is it's anti-inflammatory. Now, you already knew that because of this paper, but if you didn't, you could read through this, and it very, very... and you've got to remember that inflammation drives so many diseases in the body, like traumatic brain injury. I'm reading them here, stroke, all sorts of things. It's very good for... inflammation has been linked to the onset of a variety of chronic disorders such as Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis, epilepsy, brain damage, colorectal something, metabolic disorders, allergies, asthmatic neuroma, diarrhea, osteoarthritis, renal problems, lupus, diabetes, overweight status, anxiety, tiredness, and another disease. So that's where inflammation kicks in, and that's where, free radicals also damage. So this dampens down all those chronic inflammatory processes and chronic disease processes. So there's lots and lots of this. Now, the cool thing I like about review papers is you'll often find that they have diagrams like this one. Now, this diagram here gives a really quick summary of what it does. Now, all the papers, all the scientific data is in there, but most people just go, yeah, great, turmeric, what am I taking that for? Oh, look, and I'm going to read this very quickly. It blocks nuclear factor kappa beta, that's inflammation, which reduces chronic disease and helps treat a whole wide variety of diseases. And this is figure 2 in the paper. And again, this is a published paper in Molecules, so it's a pretty scientific paper, and it's backed up by 232 references. So that's what I like about review papers. Also, the paper talks about its antibacterial effects. So you can read through here and look at it also. It knocks off Staph aureus, for example, which is pretty cool. So turmeric is antimicrobial. It's hepatoprotective. In other words, it protects your liver. It's very good for that. So this is a nice review paper. It lowers the risk of heart disease, helps your brain by increasing brain-derived neurotrophic factor. As I'm just reading the headings here, going through here, helps your endothelial cells, which are the cells inside your blood vessels, neurodegenerative diseases it helps, like Parkinson's, Alzheimer's. And in fact, there's a massive write-up here on how it treats Alzheimer's disease. Now, I'll stop it there because you could go on forever, because this is a great paper to look at an overall view of what turmeric does. Now, on your little triangle, systemic reviews is level of evidence number 2. In other words, the second strongest piece of evidence, which is really, really important for, in other words, it's a very strong piece of evidence. Why? Because it's got a lot of background scientific studies, 232 supporting it. So it's a great place to start. Now, where do I find all these papers? Well, simple. PubMed. If you Google PubMed, you'll come up with this. It stands for public medical. In other words, it's got all the peer-reviewed studies that have been published on the internet free of charge. You can always get the abstracts for free. And of these papers, they were free full papers too, so I got them for this particular talk. So you can get a lot of free full text papers in there. Now, why would you just not read the abstract and just go through that? Well, you can. You can. That's fine. But what I want to know is how all this stuff works. If I'm teaching it, like when I was a teacher, it's like I'll say, turmeric's great for arthritis. And 90% of the time, that's all you need to know. I want to take this yellow thing and it's going to help my arthritis. That's fine. That's great. But how? And if you're really interested in knowing how things work, and you may be, like the mechanic in the family wants to know how everything works under the hood, that's fine. But this tells you how it works. Now, we know that it blocks nuclear factor kappa beta, which is a very powerful inflammatory chemical in the body, and it knocks that off. So in other words, it has a beautiful downstream effect of stopping lots of inflammation. So we know that there's p-values involved. We know what they are now, statistical inferences. A review paper doesn't have many numbers in it. A review paper has just an overview. It's like a bunch of experts talking about a topic, and the topic can be quite broad. So in this case, it's turmeric, but it's all the chronic diseases. We move up to what we call the meta-analysis, which is much more narrow, and it looks at numbers. And I've got a meta-analysis here on turmeric. And I'm going to read the title and see if you can spot the difference between the review and the meta-analysis. And here's the meta-analysis. It says the efficacy of high and low dose curcumin in knee osteoarthritis, a systemic review and meta-analysis. So you can see it's a meta-analysis. So it's the dose of just a high or low dose, they're the variables, of turmeric in knee osteoarthritis. Now, let's just go to the spoiler for the meta-analysis. Now, you've got to remember, meta-analysis in your little triangle thing is at the top. So this is the strongest piece of evidence. So this is what bugs me. As a naturopath that I am, and I hear people saying, oh, those herbs don't work. It's like, my goodness me, the strongest piece of evidence. And this is it. I'm going to read the spoiler. And this was published this year, of course, as I've said. And it says the bottom line is the results of our meta-analysis suggest that low and high dose curcuminoids have similar pain relief effects in knee osteoarthritis. Curcuminoids are also associated with better pain relief than NSAIDs, which are non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. Therefore, using curcuminoids as an adjunctive treatment of knee osteoarthritis is recommended. Now, I'm quoting that. Now, you know how it says may, and you might be going, well, that seems a bit weak. Remember, science is never settled. So it suggests, these meta-analysis suggests, and you might be going, wow, that's good. Well, in fact, I'll tell you a little bit about the results. They included 11 randomized controlled trials, so not just 2 or 3, 11. And they measured doses that were less than 1,000 milligrams or more than 1,000 milligrams of curcuminoids. So certainly if you get a supplement around 1,000 milligrams of curcuminoids, and I've seen them out there with that in it, no problem at all, then that should certainly help you, especially if you've got knee osteoarthritis. So, I mean, it helps. Look, this doesn't mean that it doesn't help you with rheumatoid and it doesn't do this, doesn't do that. This is just a specific test on a specific disease. You know, the review paper suggests it'll help any inflammatory disease, which is fine. This meta-analysis is really specifically comparing it against the NSAIDs, the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, which could be Indesid, Mobic, Voltaren, Oridis, all those anti-inflammatories. Celebrex is probably the most common one. This beats them. So, you know, it's more effective than those at treating knee osteoarthritis. Now, of course, the other benefit, and what you know if you've listened to the podcast, is that turmeric's very safe. So, meta-analysis, very, very high piece of evidence. Now, this is very interesting because, it is better than the NSAIDs. That's what the conclusion was. Now, let's dive into the paper a little bit differently. Now, as you can see here, there's a little graph here which shows you how they did the meta-analysis, which shows there's a little bit of a flow chart there. And what it says is that basically they excluded non-clinical trials, they excluded not osteoarthritis, they excluded animal studies, rheumatoid arthritis papers, and that's where they got the 11 studies from. So they started with a whole heap of studies, which was 1,516, and just, whittled them down by getting rid of, they just wanted to focus on knee osteoarthritis. And that's why this is a very good piece of evidence here. Now, this is not an interventional trial. This can be done at your computer. It's not like the randomized control trial, which is called an intervention trial. They intervened. This one is looking at the literature. So the good news, the good thing about these papers and the review papers is you don't, when you're doing them, you don't need ethics approval. You don't need to go to the university. So these are very useful for reviewers to do because then they'll just talk about them. And of course, let's say you are at home and you wanted to do a trial and, let's say you wanted to write a review paper based on whatever, say turmeric, and you wanted to look at turmeric and arthritis. And I bet you there'll be a review paper about that. You want to submit that. Where do the researchers, the scientists write these papers and they send them off to a medical journal. Now, the medical journal has a board of scientists on there, and they bring in specialists in the area in turmeric or herbal medicine. I've been a reviewer on papers before, and they send your document out to them to be reviewed. And what that's called is peer reviewed. In other words, a scientist has looked at your paper and has peer reviewed it. And it has to pass peer review before it gets published. So there's a level of safety. Yes, you have to have references galore. You can't just make anything up. And, reviewers, I've commonly said there's been a statement in there and it hasn't been referenced with a medical study. And you have to say, no, that has to be referenced with something. And if you read these papers, there's all these little numbers throughout it, 2, 3, 7, all these papers. They're references to other peer-reviewed papers. So they build on this. And for example, the first sentence here is, osteoarthritis is a common degenerative disease that results in pain, disability, poor quality of life. Osteoarthritis affects approximately 240 million people worldwide, approximately 10% of men and 18% of women. And the reference. So it's like you're making a statement, you better reference it. And that's what the peer reviews will pick up. Now compare that, and we'll go back to what I said at the start of the podcast about someone on YouTube coming up with a video. It's like, okay, this is my opinion, and it's an opinion. And it's like, okay, they think that the world's coming to end in a year's time. Great. Don't share the video with anyone else. Write back to the person who did if you're interested, write back to the person making the claim and saying, where's your evidence for that? Peer-reviewed evidence. Or if they have this magic wonder pill that's going to make you lose 30 kilos in 3 weeks, ask that person. Don't send it on to me. Just, contact them. You can usually contact these people. Show me the studies where you've done that. And it makes them accountable. And, I've got literally the papers in front of me here where I can very confidently say to you, knee osteoarthritis is treated very well with about 1,000 milligrams of curcuminoids. And you could say, where's your evidence for that? It's a meta-analysis published in Complementary Therapies in Medicine. And here's the paper here. I've got it right in front of me. Bang, you can have it. And I'll send it out to you. And it's like, aha, great. And you can look at that. So that's peer reviewing. Now, is this whole system of medicine perfect? Absolutely not. Are there flaws in it? Yes, there are. Has there been things published that shouldn't have been? Absolutely there has been. I mean, there's been some papers that, and let's say I published this paper in the Complementary Therapies in Medicine, and thousands of scientists read it around the world, and they say, hey, hang on a sec, what's this 82% business? That shouldn't be that high. And they'll write back to the journal, and what can happen is that I go, oh, gee, I didn't carry the 3, or oh, whoops, I missed that, or something like that, and the reviewers missed it, and you have a correction. So you republish a correction, and you say, look, I'm sorry, the last paper was 82%, I made 62%. It still shows you it's good. The take-home message is the same, but there was an error in it. Or I referenced something wrong, or Joe Blog did that when it was Jane Blog. Just an error. And that's one way, and that happens all the time. However, there is another level of evidence here where there's been a whole lot of fraudulent activity or really bad science done. The reviewers didn't pick it up. Then in that case, the paper will be retracted. And that happened last year in the Lancet Medical Journal, where a paper was retracted, quite a famous one for a famous infection that's going around the world now. And it was on hydroxychloroquine, which is a drug. And the paper said that, no, this stuff's dangerous, don't use it. And of course, everyone around the world freaked out because this drug's been used for 70 years. And the Lancet said, no, makes it worse. That's bad. Oh, my goodness. And all of a sudden, of course, governments freaked out, and there's laws in our country now that's still based on that. And someone said, hang on, all this science is wrong. And the Lancet went, yeah, you're right. All this stuff, this is a terrible paper. And they actually retracted the paper back. They said, no, that paper, it still exists. You can still look at it, but it's got retracted over it. In other words, don't use this paper for science or policy making or anything. And because it was published in the Lancet Medical Journal, it was used by a lot of people. Now, there are also other forms of peer reviewing which can be not as effective. So these are sciences with numbers in it, but there is a branch of science called social science, And there's a famous story that was released in a newspaper, and it's about 3 years ago. And it says, duped academical journal publishers rewrite Mein Kampf, which is a book written by Hitler, as a feminist manifesto. Now, what they did in this particular, they got 3 scientists with PhDs, and they wrote ridiculous scientific papers on gender studies, and they rewrote Mein Kampf and called it feminazi, and they published it to the social sciences, and it was peer-reviewed and accepted as good science. So there are flaws in this system. They even wrote a paper about if you're at because one of them had a dog. If you're at a dog park and the dogs hump each other, that's evidence of rape culture in our society. That was published in the gender studies area. So because social science is sort of opinionative and that sort of thing, they got away with it. This is hopefully rare, but very interesting how the best science, the best laid plans can go astray. But typically, we want to actually keep peer review is typically a good thing. There are exceptions. Nothing's perfect. That's why they have confidence limits. There is another type of evidence and studies, and there's 2 types. There's qualitative evidence, which is what which was what I'm about to talk about, and then there's quantitative evidence. Now, quantitative gives you numbers, okay, which is what I like. These are all quantitative studies, okay? But how do you measure someone's attitude? Now, my wife, I think I mentioned in the last podcast, was doing is doing a master's in nursing, and they had to measure the attitudes of nurses to interventions for mental health. And there's no numbers involved in that, so you interview these people, and that's what we call a qualitative study. There's no quantities involved. They're interviews. And what the reviewer and what the paper says, look, I've interviewed 28 nurses and most of them think this, this and this. And that's another form of science too. Not my favourite form of science because it's a little bit more grey, a little bit more subjective. It's easier to be influenced, but it is another form of science, and there's people who are passionate about it, but I'm not. Because it's not my area of expertise. I really like the quantitative stuff where you can measure blood results and randomised controlled trials and all these sorts of things, and they're the best forms of evidence. So where do other pieces of evidence come into here? Expert opinion comes in just above in vitro testing. So don't listen to what I say. If you don't believe that osteoarthritis can be treated by turmeric, ask me for the paper. I'll send it to you. You know what I mean? And I love people doing that. It's certainly not offensive or anything like that. But when you're on YouTube, when you're on Facebook and someone makes a claim, ask them for supportive evidence. That way you can be a peer reviewer at the same time and stop the spreading of fake news like is going around the world. So keep an eye out for fake news and ask the person to reference their claims. And they often say, I haven't got any references, it's just my opinion. That's totally fine. You're allowed your own opinion. There's no problem with that. But facts are not opinions, and facts don't care about feelings. Have you heard of that saying? That's the other saying. And there is one other saying I'd like to say in science that people misdrew, which is correlation doesn't mean causation. So if something happens like, here's a bunch of turmeric eaters over there, they eat a lot of turmeric and they've got low arthritis. You know, none of them got arthritis. That could be correlation, but not necessarily causation. It could be the turmeric they're eating. Absolutely, it could be, but it could be the fact that they're to get the turmeric, they have to climb up the mountain and do exercise and dig it out and do exercise so they don't have arthritis. So that's the correlation and causation. So keep in mind there's that aspect of science. And the way you test that is with a double-blind, randomized controlled trial. So then it takes that out of it. So that's why all these science things affect. So look, I hope you've enjoyed this. It's about 40 minutes of nerd, and it's just so important that you become a reviewer out there. And thank you very much, and we'll see you next week.